Hi, everybody. This is Dan Liebenson, and I am back here with B'nai Lappi for this week's episode of the Oral Talmud. Hi, B'nai.
Hey, how you doing, Dan?
I'm doing good. How are you doing? You're just coming off of the biggest queer Talmud camp in Svara's history.
That's right. Oh my God, I am both exhausted and just exquisitely so high. It was amazing.
And probably a lot of our viewers here know what queer Talmud camp is all about and know a lot about Svara, but not all do. So can you say like one sentence about what queer Talmud camp is?
Yeah, Queer Talmud Camp is an enormous gathering of queer, radical, freaky, fringy folk who are passionate to get in on the Jewish conversation and roll up their sleeves and get into the Beit Midrash and learn Talmud for 5 days, stark, like really rigorously, and also have lots of fun. There's the usual camp stuff like talent show and dance party and workshops. And it's a community that's forming that I never even imagined.
Mm.
That's becoming a movement of my dream of players from the margins getting on the field to go option three in Judaism. So it's really exciting.
Yeah. Actually, like I hadn't thought of it before, but like Yavne was the first queer Talmud camp.
That's right. That's right. My colleague Mo says it exactly that way, actually.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
Well, and I should mention that this was Queer Talmud Camp Diaspora Edition, meaning it was on Zoom for anyone who's concerned that it
that's
actually,
right.
actually
That
was not in person this year.
that's right.
So before we get started, we should also mention another thing. Today is August 7th, 2020, and today, sadly, Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz passed away. He is um, well, I mean, spent his entire, he was the 83 when he died. He was the translator. He translated the entire Talmud into modern Hebrew, and then from his modern Hebrew translation, others translated an English, authorized English version of that, which is what Sefaria uses as their basic Talmud text online. So when we are using a translation of the Talmud for this show, that's his translation with a little bit of tweaks that we made. So he really an incredible scholar. And um, I put actually in the notes for today's show that even though Svara's motto is that the revolution will not be translated, that there's still that's not 100% how we see it, and that their translation's important, and I mean, there's no one really who's done more to make the Talmud widely accessible, and for those who don't have the capacity to access it in the original, or at least for now. Than he. It's an incredible life's work.
Yeah. I really see our work at Svara as being in his lineage because what he was about was access.
Hmm.
He was about making sure those who had been locked out of the Beit Midrash um, would have the opportunity to learn and add their voice to the conversation. Um, yeah, as I said in my um, post this morning, I never met him, but he felt like the friend, the teacher friend who was always there, who you could go to after after you had spent a ridiculous number of joyful, exquisite hours in confusion with your chavruta over a text, to finally say, okay, we're stuck. Let's pull the volume off the shelf and peak at the smallest amount, just enough to get back on track, to go back to the joy of the figuring out. And he was always there. So it's a sad day.
Yeah, for me, I mean, I have a little bit of a personal, not that I met him or anything, but when I was 14, our family moved to Israel, and for whatever reason, we were put in the Orthodox school system. I mean, the religious school system, and I was 14, I was in ninth grade, and there was already people in my year who had been in the religious school system, had already studied some Talmud in earlier grades, and I hadn't studied any, and I basically knew nothing about what the Talmud was. And and it was translated like into modern Hebrew, which I barely knew, but at least it was something. And really, if I hadn't had his work, um, I don't know what that would have been like for me. I was the only kid in the class who was allowed to use the Steintel. So it's interesting in light of what you talk about translating, that in Israel too, like you weren't allowed to use the modern Hebrew translation, but I was, because I was a new immigrant. And what's
Yeah,
amazing to me to think about is that at that time Steinsaltz was the age that I am now, more or less. And somehow he translated the whole Talmud. Or I don't think the whole. I think he hadn't done quite the whole thing at that point, but a lot of. I mean, it's just incredible what he achieved at a young age as well.
yeah. And I think because when I started learning Talmud in the volumes, I have what I peek at when I'm stuck is his Hebrew translation. It doesn't feel so much like cheating, and
Uh-huh.
it still preserves, because I'm not a native speaker of Hebrew, it still preserves that figuring out, that the joy of the figuring out. Um, yeah.
Well, I said to you that I was thinking this morning, and maybe we should just like talk about translation and talk about Steinsaltz today, but we won't. We'll talk about that another time. We want to dive into a text today. We've had a couple of guests over the last few weeks, and then last week we had a kind of impromptu conversation about Tisha B'Av, the ninth of Av, which actually was useful in our project, but we'd had a last minute scheduling change. So this is the first time in about a month, I think, that we are really going back to studying a text. It's funny because in the early weeks of the show, we had originally said we were going to alternate weeks, and then for all kinds of scheduling reasons, it's ended up being clumped. So we have a bunch of weeks when we're studying together, and a bunch of weeks when we have guests. And like I keep saying on the podcast, it'll all be smoothed out. We'll change the order a little bit, but I'm excited to get back into this studying with you. I mean, I'll just say personally, it's the highlight of my time to say, I'd say week because it's not every week, but I mean, just to be able to like talk through a text with you is it's like a joy.
I feel the
So,
same way.
so I'm excited to do this. So today's text, so I guess I want to remind people, since it has been a while, that we've been looking at a number of stories, a number of texts, and I guess not quite stories. We started on this show with more texts that were in the kind of the story genre, the Agadah, the stories of the early rabbis in Yavne and in that sort of early period. We'll go back to stories of that nature, but we talked a lot about both the storytelling genre in the Talmud, and also, well, who are the characters that they're telling these stories about? Here, we're looking at a bunch of texts that they do have story elements to them, but they're not quite law. There's something in between. They're sort of in the Venn diagram between story and more, let's say, formal processes. And specifically, we've been looking at a number of texts that, in some fashion, describe, you've put it, how the rabbis see the ideal person. And I think it's really how they see the ideal person who is engaged in this process of reimagining Judaism, what their task was, right?
Or maybe the process that in turn creates
Uh-huh.
this aspirational person who will create that liberatory aspirational world.
Mm,
So I think there's a feedback, there's sort of some sort of a photosynthesis cycle going on here between, this is the way that we create a certain kind of person,
mm.
and what that person will then do, and around and around.
Yeah, and just, we looked at some texts, especially about this idea that the ultimate person engaged with this is capable of even making something that the Torah explicitly forbids into something that's not forbidden. Specifically, this idea of the creepy crawly thing that is impure by definition, that you're even able to make that pure through your reasoning, through your thinking.
Right. And let's remember that that exact text or the parallel, really the duplication of that text, comes immediately before the text we're about to learn today. I feel like we need to
Right.
step back and stitch together the last two texts we've done, because they are all on the same double-sided page of Talmud is what we're talking about today.
Right. And that is in the tractate called Eruvin, which is about sort of, I think, what did we say? Did we talk about this? Well, we said, well, you could call it something like loopholes
Yeah.
or
Legal
legal
fictions.
fictions. Yeah, legal fictions, and so we think of an eruv as those who know what an eruv is typically think of it as this like string that's tied around some area of space that somehow makes it possible that you can carry things on Shabbat that you normally wouldn't be able to carry. But there are actually a number of different kinds of eruvs. And then you're like, well, how does a string, how does a string relate to like putting some food in a certain place? That's a different kind of eruv. And the answer is that we're probably thinking of eruv in the wrong way. If you think of it as strings, what it really means is legal fictions. A way, yeah. You want to?
I was just, if I connected the dots between overturning Torah in 150 different ways and the string last time, I've forgotten it. Now it's hitting me in a whole new way. I don't think I ever
think you made that connection. Yeah.
No, it's like the penny is just finally dropping for me.
Exactly. Like, why is this an Eruvin? Oh, of course. Like, this is the whole tractate that is about basically overturning things in the Torah through cleverness, right? Yeah.
I never got that. Okay.
Yeah. But so for the folks watching at home, we're actually learning here. Like, this isn't a lecture. And by the way, I will note one other thing that is just occurring to me is that in the Daf Yomi, the daily page of Talmud cycle, this is coming up in about 3 weeks. So it happens to be, I know you have mixed feelings about negative feelings. But,
we'll put a sticky on Daf Yomi. One day when we talk about translation and other things, we'll.
Oh, but we are actually talking about that. I forget if it's next week or the week after, because we are going to be talking to Ilana Kirshen, who wrote a book about her study of the daily Talmud page Daf Yomi. So it is going to come up soon.
That's going to be fun.
Yeah. But for those who are doing it, transgressively or not, I'm definitely doing it in the transgressive way because my teacher doesn't like it.
You're sweet.
I think we're about a week away from the end of the tractate of Shabbat, which I'm going to be very relieved about because it's been quite boring from my perspective, and going into Eruvin. So this is coming up relatively soon. So for those of you who are doing Daf Yomi, then maybe this is a little bit of a preview. So okay, and what we have been doing is a little bit of a preview. So let's take a look at. So B'nai, do you want to set this up in any particular way, or that we've set it up?
Yeah. Well, for me, this page of Talmud has 3 blocks of ideas, and I'm still not sure how the 3 blocks all relate, or. So let me set those 3 blocks up and then remind us that the previous page is also connected. So the top of this daf, the top of this side of the folio page, is the story of Rabbi Meir. And we remember that Rabbi Meir is introduced as someone who God himself, God itself, knows is the greatest in his generation. And in spite of that, the law was never set according to him, because it seemed that none of his colleagues could ever suss out what he really believed, and if the case he was making on a certain issue was really what he believed, and therefore they should fix the law that way, or he was just pushing them in their thinking and arguing both sides, so on and so forth. But it acknowledges that the way he destabilized every certainty, quote unquote, enlightened the eyes of the sages. So you were better off having a Rabbi Meir at your table, even though you couldn't really use him as a source for a specific halacha. Okay, so that's the first block of this text. The second block are the 2 stories of his students, one of whom, for everything that was like yes, this way, this is the law. He had 1,000 different reasons why that was the case. And the other student, the veteran student in Yavne, who could overturn the Torah in 150 different ways. And we had learned the parallel text of that a number of months ago, I think. Then comes this third block. And put a sticky on this third block, because on the previous page in our last session together, we studied, you know, what I like to think of as Rabbi Meir's curriculum. Like, how did he become Rabbi Meir? How did he get to be this kind of a thinker? And we learned that first he went to Rabbi Akiva's academy, and he just could not tolerate, literally stand what was going on there. He couldn't grasp it, or he couldn't handle it. Then he goes over to Rabbi Yishmael's academy, and he learns his, you know, he learns the basics, Gemara. Then he goes back to Rabbi Akiva, and now he can savar svara. Now he knows how to and can tolerate the project of radical innovation. Okay, so that's Rabbi Meir. Then he becomes who he is. Then we have his students. Then we have this story today. So I think that's the context for this. And I think we should revisit the question of, what does this story have to do with the whole Rabbi Meir narrative?
Right. And I will also just note, and I think this will come up in conversation later as to why, but I've mentioned before that I'm a lawyer. I was, you know, I was trained in American law schools, and I was a law professor for a while. And I actually taught law for 3 years at a Catholic law school that, for various reasons, encouraged us to use religious works as in our courses. And I actually I taught contracts to first-year law students. So really, it's like the classic, you know, first-year course of law school. And on the very first day of law school, I would teach this text as part of my opening to the first day of contracts. So we'll talk about it. I think it's a little bit different, maybe from a classical take on this text, but I just want to note that it's not only in terms of the kind of person that we imagine is the best kind of person to work on Jewish law. Like, I actually think that these qualities are applicable universally, far beyond. I shouldn't say universally, but definitely far beyond.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start.
Okay.
So I'll remind folks that we have a Sefaria source sheet. If you look at the page for this show, which is oraltalmud.com, or on our Facebook post, you can get the link to the Sefaria source sheet so that you can follow along yourself. But we'll also share the text when we're reading it on here. So it starts by saying, Rabbi Abba said that Shmuel said, for 3 years, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel disagreed. We can translate those as the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel. That would be the most narrow, what you call an inside translation. But I think that it's probably a better translation to say the school of Shammai, the school of Hillel, and think of those as like philosophical schools, like for Greek philosophy. These were not necessarily the people named Shammai and Hillel, who were sort of proto-rabbis that lived around the early first century, late first century BCE, early first century CE, and but they had these schools of their thought that persisted longer than that, and these schools had different points of view. Typically, Shammai is a more conservative, textualist type of point of view, narrowly deciding laws, and Hillel has a more sort of expansive, progressive view of how the law should be interpreted. So they would typically disagree. And these said, one side said...
You know what? Before we even move on, I think the important thing to notice about this opening line is the 3 years. Right? So it's one thing to say they disagreed. It's another thing to say they disagreed for 3 years. And I think what we have to remember is, with most people with whom we have a profound disagreement, we have it, and then the relationship is over. But I think what's important about this line is that they stayed in relationship to one another throughout this ongoing disagreement. So I think that's important just to notice from the get-go. And I think the text is is suggesting that kind of longevity of relationship in spite of profound disagreement.
And it's not on this page, I don't believe, but there's a famous statement in the Talmud that Beit Hillel, the house of Hillel, the school of Hillel, the school of Shammai, they would, again, we don't like the way that this is put exactly, but they would marry their daughters to their son, one another, whatever, something like that, and meaning that they, even though
sticky
they
on that,
disagreed,
but in spite of their, that's kind of the marker of ultimate concession to or willingness to stay in relationship.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, great.
Okay. So, so they disagreed for 3 years, and these said, one side said the halacha, the law, the tradition is in accordance with our views, our opinion, and the other side said the halacha is in accordance with our opinion. Ultimately, a divine voice emerged and proclaimed, both these and those are the words of the living God, and this could be translated, it is Divrei Elohim Chayim. And depending on what you consider the adjective and the direct object, whatever the exact terms are, that you could translate it as the living God. And you've said before that it's important to kind of note that the Talmud uses different names of God in different times, and that you think that there's a relationship, like when God is referred to, for example, as the Holy Blessed One, that tends to be in a certain, you have to kind of put that in relationship with texts that also use the Holy Blessed One, right? And here it's not using the Holy Blessed One; it's using a different name of God, the living God, Elohim Chayim.
And also that. Not only should you imagine or think about the other texts where God has that name, but what might the editor be saying or suggesting when pointing to this particular conceptualization or aspect of God? If this is a God who speaks and the world comes into being, maybe there's some, subtext here about our use of words. Right? We've seen that before. Or if God is being referred to as the merciful one, maybe there's a little bit of a hint of, check your Rahmanes, check your mercy going on here. So that's one possibility, that this should be actually capital T, capital L, the living God. That's the name of God. So what does that mean to be like living? Maybe it's about being in process, in constant change, growth. I don't know. Maybe there's something there.
I hadn't thought about this, but I suppose it could also be translated as the God of life.
Yeah.
Just a thought. I don't know if that takes us anywhere.
Yeah, for sure. Or as you say, the living could be referring to the words.
Right. So the living words of God.
Yeah.
In other words, so one way to say these, both Hillel's views and Shammai's views are the words of the living God, or both Hillel's words and Shammai's words are the living words of God.
Right. So we have to sort of surface, well, what's living? What does that mean? What does that add here?
For me, the reason, like I have to, I admit that I'm no linguist, or what's the word that Talmud scholars are? I forget that,
philologist.
Philologist, yes. I'm not no philologist, and so it may be that in Aramaic there's some. It's clearly one or the other. I mean, this generally is translated. I generally have seen this translated as the words of the living God, and there may well be a strong justification for that in linguistics or philology. I usually translate it when I teach it as the living words of God, because it makes more sense to me that the idea is that the words are alive. The words are not a dead letter, right? I mean, we talk about a dead letter. Living words is the opposite of a dead letter. And so when you think about law as a dead letter, that means, I mean, that's a pejorative way of saying it, but the basic idea is that the law is the law. I think, I forget which American law person said it, the law is an ass. Like the law is just the law. The law is just there. We have to live with it. You can change it, but the law is a thing. It's there, and as opposed to, and in American constitutional interpretation, we have, we have one of the versions. I think Justice Breyer is seen in the school of the living Constitution. The idea that the words actually do change their meaning in substantial ways over time because they kind of live within the larger world, and it can actually change. So that to me is I like that idea, the idea that the words have life and the words can change, and it's actually part of our task is to understand what these words mean now, as opposed to the words of the living God, which feels more like, I don't know, it feels to me like it gives God more power. It kind of says like God is still around here, and
Yeah.
these words we gotta know that God is out there. God has some, right? That's kind of.
But I think here the words that are being described aren't the words of our Constitution. I don't think they're talking about the words of Torah. They're talking about the words that one another speak. But I think the implication still holds. I think it's definitely suggesting what you're saying. So this is, we so have to just sit back on this line. This is a line, elu ve'elu, these and those, has become, that phrase has become a foundational principle of the entire rabbinic project in rabbinic Judaism ever since this moment.
Mm-hmm.
And it reminds me of what we talked about in our last episode, which I had learned from my teacher, David Kramer, which is that the real rabbinic revolution was the idea that whereas before we had one single text where we could go to find God's word, now we have other places where we can go, including our own svara, our own moral intuition, but that ultimately none of us can ever claim to know God's will. Prophecy is over, and now there is indeterminate truth. We can make our best guesses, and that's all we can do. And it feels like this text is I'm not sure if the word is articulation, embodiment of that idea, but I think this is it. This is what becomes the Jewish statement that's now going to be a core principle in our tradition. And that in turn is something that I'm always thinking about when I think about what a new option 3 is. Some of our core, I used to think the core principles stay the same, but the way we play them out, our practices, our holidays, our, rituals change. But that's not exactly true either. I think our core foundational values and principles somewhat, I don't think they change. I'm not sure. I'm working at it, but I think they change. And I think this moment in our history is a shift in how we deal with that indeterminacy of truth and the fact that we accept something like that. I don't know.
I would point out that our friend Vanessa Oakes has this idea of Jewish sensibilities, that there are these kind of, deeply ingrained ways that Jews kind of are and think, and this, I don't remember if this is one of the ones she lists or the Lippman Cantor Foundation.
No, I think it is. I think it is.
There's also the Lippman Cantor Foundation, which is built on her work and takes this sort of idea seriously and tries to take it into the world of philanthropy. It also has a take on these, what are some main representative Jewish sensibilities, and this is definitely one of those. So like you said, this idea has become extremely fundamental, that somehow, because it's just to point out, it's that opinions that are contradictory to one another, the opposite of one another, are both the words of God.
Right. I mean, that's the vexing paradox. It's not just divergent opinions. I think it's suggesting completely opposite.
Right.
And according to our rules of logic, incompatible and unable to both exist as true at the same time, are now being said to actually both be either fully true and fully in contradiction, or is it, and I'm not sure, each has a partial truth. I don't know. What do you think?
I want to go with they're fully true, right?
Yeah.
And I also think that what it means is that, like, I think that a really fundamental piece of this is to say that what the tradition is now or in the past is not necessarily the same thing as what God wants.
Mhm.
And in a way, this is a stark example of that, because it says very explicitly, God actually is fine either way. God, these are both the words of God. In fact, maybe God doesn't want it decided one way or the other, because they're both the words of the living God. So God is not only okay with it either way. Actually, God would prefer both ways,
Mhm.
right? If that's the decision, if that's the basis for your decision. However, as we'll see, the tradition actually chooses one of the ways. But don't be, don't be speaking for God, and that's where, like, it makes me think about, like, what at least Judaism here is aspiring towards, in contrast to what you hear from, I think of it as certain kinds of evangelical preachers, but there's certainly plenty of Jewish rabbis that talk this way, that they are speaking for God, and they know, and you should do this because it's what God wants. But that's different here. This is saying, no, it may well be that you should do it because that's the tradition, but don't confuse that's what God demands.
Yeah. And we heard that from Professor Boyarin as well. The idea that you really can't say what you absolutely can't say what God said. You can say what you think God said.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
But
Um,
even that is a question here. What you think, right? I mean,
uh-huh.
it may well be. I mean, and that's the interesting thing. Like, I remember also, like, there's this phrase. I don't know if it's from the Talmud. It probably is, but in rabbinic Judaism, this idea that there are 70 faces to the Torah, right? Meaning, or
Right.
that you can look at the Torah from like 70 different angles. And I remember when I was a Hillel director, and I had a kind of, the same kind of interpretive approach that I have now, which is kind of contrarian and, and secular, we could call it. Or, I often will read the Torah and say, well, let's just read it as if God is not all knowing or omniscient, or let's just read God here as the character that's like the big boss, or whatever, the natural course of things. And I would say to my Orthodox students who felt uncomfortable with that reading, I'd say, look, I'm not saying that I'm right, but I'm saying that maybe there's 70 faces to the Torah. Like, maybe this is one of them, right? Maybe if you only are willing to read the text with a set of assumptions like God is omniscient, God is a being, etc., like, what if you're actually missing one of the 70 faces? And so let's at least give it a shot. And I'm not asking you to agree with that perspective. I'm just asking you to accept it for this hour so that we can read this text and see if anything interesting comes out of that reading. And I think inevitably it does, if people are willing to do that. And I think what's interesting about this text is it potentially takes that idea even further and says, it's not just like 70 perspectives. It's like, they're actually all the words of God.
Mm-hmm. And I think we shouldn't fail to dig into the phrase, this heavenly voice, the bat call.
Mm.
So we have a relationship with this bat call, and sometimes we listen to the bat call, and sometimes we disregard the bat call. Right? We learn the story of the oven of Achnai, where the bat call comes out and says to the sages, what's your problem with Rabbi Eliezer? He's right. And Rabbi Yoshua basically says, sit down, we outnumber you. You told us to go with the majority, right? So as we're about to see, they seem to listen to the bat call here.
Mm.
And one of my questions is, why do they listen to the bat call here and they don't listen to the bat call elsewhere? Typically, they don't listen to a bat call.
Mm.
But it seems like they're about to. So let's leave that on the table.
Okay, that's a good one. All right.
But did you fully flesh out why you bring this up on the first day, or do you want to save that?
I think I'm going to save it. It's related to what comes next.
Okay, great.
So they're both the words of the living God, or the living words of God. However, the halacha, the tradition, the law, is in accordance with the opinion of Beit Hillel. Here it says definitively, it's almost always, right? It's not always, it's almost always.
Oh, yeah, that almost is not in the original.
Yeah, no, it's not in the original or the but I'm saying to you, right, there are a few cases where it's not, but but in the original it just says, oh, it implies always. Right?
Yeah, it implies that according to God, or as represented by the Bat Kol, the halacha should always be according to Beit Hillel. But you're right, it's interesting that actually the rabbis don't always, usually they do follow the opinion, in fact, and sort of quote unquote codify the opinion of Beit Hillel, but not always. So they're in those times, they're actually going against the Bat Kol.
So that's actually interesting, because that means this is not necessarily the exception to the rule that they don't follow the Bat Kol. They follow it a little bit here, but not
right.
Or they follow it a lot, but not completely.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is actually, I should have made a correction to the translation here, and I didn't, because I think it's not quite right. But it says, the Gemara asks, since. Oh, go ahead.
Yes. That's always been my question about, I didn't notice that. I also reviewed the translation and didn't notice that, but it's always been my question here at this moment in the text. Is this next line the continuation of the Bat Kol, or is this the narrator of the story jumping in? I don't think it's clear at all. So let's get this next line out.
Yeah, but so I'm just looking at the Hebrew there. It says v'chi, sort of, and therefore, or v'chi me'achar. So it's sort of like there is a connection. There is a kind of a drawing a connection. But the part that I feel is not quite right in the translation is where it says that since both these and those are the words of the living God, why was the house of Hillel, the school of Hillel, privileged to have the halacha established in accordance with their opinion? I don't know that privileged is the right way to translate this. In the original, it is zachu, which means like more than, it can mean privileged. It can mean something like we're worthy of.
Right.
And probably we're worthy of is a better translation. And actually, I would be comfortable with we're worthy of based on what I have to say about it. But privileged is not necessarily wrong, but it's a good case. It's a good example of the problematics of translation, because especially if you are translating, I think that you can be a translator who is like poetic enough that you find the way to translate something that it gets a lot of nuance if it has nuance in the original. Steinsaltz himself, by the way, did not do the English translation, so I think there's only a limit to, I don't want to blame him here, even though it's his English translation under his name, but whoever translated it into English, I'm not sure that privilege is right. I think that, because I don't think it necessarily has to do with privilege. When we say privilege, I think we have the idea that like somebody's so good, and so we're going to give him like an award because he was so good. We like him so much. He was, right? He gets a privilege, as opposed to sort of worthy of, or right, that actually maybe he earned it, but not in a way that he earned it because he was so nice. He earned it because, and this is why I teach in law school, because this is good legal. This is a good way for lawyers to behave. This is how you win cases. It's not because the jury says, "Oh, how nice you are, I want you to." It's because it actually works. So I would look for the translation that allows it to go either way, because it might mean privileged, but it might mean something a little different.
Got it. So for you, merit doesn't really help. It's more like earned.
Yeah. Like, what did I say earlier? Now I can't remember.
Privilege.
No, before, like, what I came up with something on the fly and now I've forgotten it, but like just a minute ago, but it was like, we're worthy of. Or
yeah,
something.
Worthy.
Is that what I said? But the idea is that, to my mind, what I have to say ultimately about this is like, the school of Hillel was a better law school, and they taught better advocacy skills. And the reason why the law is decided according to Hillel is not because Hillel was chosen as the more meritorious, better person, and therefore you make the law according to him. I mean, that seems like an arbitrary reason to like, what, God doesn't care that the laws or whoever's making the decisions doesn't care that both the words of the living God says, we might as well give it to the nice guy. I don't like that. I think it's a more interesting to say, well, wait a second, why did these behaviors lead to the law? being decided this way through natural course of things, not through some, person deciding.
Yeah. So we haven't quite gotten the characteristics out,
Yeah.
but you're saying the characteristics that we're about to see
Yeah.
that were in the folks in the House of Hillel led to that, those characteristics, those human traits shaped their law such that the law came out better.
Or something like that.
Something,
But
okay.
we'll get to
All
it.
right, let's take a look at the characteristics.
Okay. So the reason is that they, here meaning the members of the school of Hillel, they were agreeable and forbearing. I think it's, it's always hard to know is exactly the right translation of this. Is it? I think it's aluvin v'nochin in the original.
Yeah, nochin va'aluvin.
Nochin va'aluvin. So I don't know. You want to say anything about those words?
Yeah, let's see. It's like nochin. It comes from the root noach, which means to rest. It's like a kindness. Yeah, they were kind, they were comfort. There's certain like a sense of comforting about it.
In modern Hebrew, lanuach is to rest. It comes from this, but so it comes from it's like they're not like they're on a low. They're not agitated, right? They're
or agitating. They don't. They're not like triggering or hurtful. Something like that. Yeah, and aluvin, for me, it has a kind of humility, right?
Yeah, for me, and I'm definitely impacted by modern Hebrew here, so I'm not sure that I've totally got it in its original, but because aluv is kind of really like it's kind of got almost like a negative connotation, like pathetic, just kind of. Like, and I don't think that's what it's trying to mean here, but it's still in that same register of, low, right? Just like humble,
Yeah.
so it's like humble and quiet, right? Something like that. And here's an example of what I would talk about in law school is that I would say, like, when you think about the typical lawyer that is successful as a lawyer, I think a lot of people think of like Alan Dershowitz, who's in trouble these days, but you think of somebody who's yelling and banging on the table and that kind of thing. And every once in a while, there's a lawyer that succeeds that way. But most lawyers who are successful are not anything like that. Most lawyers who are successful are quiet, get their work done, say like, I'm just a country lawyer, what do I know? You're right, and it's just like, right, and win you over through their humility, and then just say, well, I looked at the facts and I looked at, here's what I see. And it's actually the exception that proves the rule, that these highly combustible lawyers, it's actually usually an ineffective technique. That's one piece.
What you're raising up for me is, if these character traits help one yield better law and come up with more compassionate or considered norms for our world, there seems to be something that kind of freezes your mind about being combative and certain and not humble. It's like that those traits prevent you from seeing I don't know, bigger pieces of the truth. I can't quite find the words, but so
I mean, if you're aggressively lobbying and advocating for a position in that kind of typical, what you would imagine is the opposite of humble and quiet, right? Aggressive, bombastic, you're not listening. You're not there to listen. You're there to prove, and you're not open. You're, like you say, you're not open. You're there with a certain orientation, and the Talmud somehow is saying here, that orientation's not the orientation we want, right? Or it's not the orientation.
That's right.
We,
That's right.
so,
And I really appreciate you saying listening. I think that's what it's about.
well, that, and that what comes next. So let's
Great.
move on. So so there, again, here's translated agreeable and forbearing, or quiet and humble. And then there's a bit of explanation here showing restraint when affronted, and so that's Steindal's point of view. And they would teach both their own statements, their own views, and the statements of the House of Shammai. They would. So this is saying that the members of the House of Hillel would not only teach their own views, but they would also teach the views of the House of Shammai. And the third quality is that, moreover, basically they would teach the positions of the House of Shammai first. So it's not only that they would teach both, they would first teach Shammai and then teach what they have to say about it.
Right. So my question at this point is, are they, I think the kind of restrictive, slightly cynical read is that this was it's a great stratagem for winning an argument, to lift up the other person's opinion just so you can more adequately knock it down. But I don't think that's what's going on here. I don't think it's just a strategy. But I'm not completely sure, why they were doing that. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think that part of it is a strategy. Like, I totally agree with you that it's not only a strategy, but I think it's worth talking about it as a strategy and to say, look, again, think about the opposite of what's being described here. The combative, bombastic lawyer who talks about, this one position. You can't see it any other way. No reasonable person would see it any other way. I can't even imagine, right? That's not convincing, because, it might be convincing to some people, but other people are like, wait a second, I see it another way. And you're saying that I'm stupid. I'm not going to go with you, right? So there's that. So to say,
but I think that is what is conventionally convincing. Right. I think most people aren't convinced by that. And I think this text is trying to say, we actually don't want a world. We want to cultivate people who are not convinced by that.
Yeah, I'm not sure that that's typically convincing, though. Like, that's what I'm trying to say. Like, I think that we think that is convincing, and sometimes it is. Look, I mean, we have some evidence of that in our world today, but I actually also think that there's a certain view of humanity here that says, actually, at the end of the day, like, that's not so convincing. That might be convincing in the short term, but that's not how you really make change stick. And by the way, I say this as a critique of both sides in our political debates today. Like, I'm not sure that the left couldn't benefit from some of this advice, and to say, like, actually, we could be more convincing if we weren't so bombastic, even though we have a right to be, like, even though, right, it's to say, like, is there a way that we could, say, hey, look, I hear you guys, I understand what's at stake for you. I understand what you stand to lose from the revolution that I'm advocating for. So don't think that I don't understand you. And nevertheless, here's what I think needs to happen. Like, I actually think it's worth a try. Like, I have some faith in some degree of a kind of a faith in humanity that says, like, actually, I think that would be a good way. So I don't know, like, but for sure, the Talmud is saying that's what we want. We want to build a world where that would be true. But part of me thinks it actually is the world is the world that we have.
So what's coming up for me is the question of whether they're ultimately getting at the best way to convince, or are they talking about the best way to relate to one another and the stance we should have toward one another in relationship generally, and more specifically to people with whom we profoundly disagree.
Yeah, I believe it's both. I'll just say one more sentence about the strategy part, because I agree with you. It's the less interesting part, except for law school, where I think it actually is interesting, is to say, like, just to make sure that here you are on the first day of law school, you've seen a lot of TV. Don't buy that stuff. That's not actually what makes it clear. Let me make sure that you understand that it's to be humble. It's to not hide the ball of the other side's opinions, to actually confront it, not only to to admit that it's there, not only to admit that it's there, but to give it its best argument first, and then you can shoot it down. But don't and do that honestly, right? Don't do it only as a stratagem. It is a good stratagem, but don't do it as a game. Do it because it's right. There probably is right on the other side somewhere, and so do your best to articulate it, and that will also win you the honest kind of sense of where the jury or whoever is gonna listen to you. So I think that it actually, and it's all three of them, right? The typical belief about how a lawyer should be or how a person should be convincing an argument is to be aggressive, to not say anything about the other sides other than to slam it down, and certainly not to make a full-throated defense of the other side before you've even talked about your own side. And so if you think about the opposite of that, then I think that actually is effective in advocacy in general, in law and in other places. But let's go to what you're talking about, because I agree. It's more interesting. It's so fundamentally like about the world that is trying to be imagined here.
Yeah, I think for me, it speaks to some kind of profound empathy. It's saying, get into the other person's head and heart and hear them, really listen to them. That's not only a strategy for winning, it's a strategy for being a more human
Mhm.
being, and for helping them feel seen and I don't know, it feels like it leads to a more authentic encounter through which I'm going to grow and you're going to grow. And that's ultimately what we want, right?
Well, and I don't know that the Talmud, sort of intends this. I don't know that it doesn't. I suspect that it probably doesn't. But when you think about it, if I articulate your position, your contrary position before I articulate my own, there are actually two things that can happen, and often do happen in a real relationship. I mean, think about a relationship with a spouse, or a partner in work, or someone like that you're having a disagreement with. There is actually no third party to make the decision most of the time. So why do you potentially conduct yourself this way out of purity, like not because you're doing it as a stratagem, but because this is actually the best way to be in relationship with somebody? Well, if I articulate your position and I say, basically, right, class like that, the kind of cliche version of that is all the active listening stuff that we're taught. So
That's
what I hear you saying is,
that was what was coming up for me. Yeah.
so if I really say, wait, so what I hear you saying is this, um, and I actually am open and I'm actually thinking about it, I might say, yeah, I think you're right, actually. And at the moment where I say I think you're right, the position of the school of Shammai has now become the position of the school of Hillel. So the law is always according to the school of Hillel because he changed his mind, right? That's option number one, right? And option number two is when I say to you, Shammai, what I hear you saying is X, Y, and Z, and I take that really seriously. Here's how I would respond to it, and here's how I think of it. Well, maybe Shammai changes his mind, and then the law is also according to Hillel, right? But it wasn't in contradiction. It wasn't that Hillel was chosen or merited in the sense that he merited it because he was a good guy. The law is according to Hillel because they actually don't have opposite opinions anymore, and I think that's worth considering.
I love that. I never thought of that. And I think there's a third option, as I always say. Three options, three and only
Right.
three and only three. But the third option is that when you get into the other person's head, your position is likely to shift somewhat.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's not just that Hillel expressed the other person's, in Hebrew, the verb here is vishonin, and they taught, but literally it means to repeat or
Mm-hmm.
restate or to review. I'm liking review, to like look a second time. Oh, that's not bad. Right? Maybe it's to consider a second time, not just the first. Oh, this is not bad. It's not just they taught it, but they considered it and then considered a second time. What about that?
Because you're wait, if I'm understanding what you're saying, that it's actually the shonin, which we should point out comes from the root of the number two, shnaim, that it's not only that they taught it twice, basically.
Well, no, that's not exactly what I was saying. What I was saying, that it might not be taught at all. It might not be that, oh, Beit Hillel got the law fixed according to their opinion because they taught not only their own opinion, but the other guy's opinion, but they thought twice. They gave a second.
Yeah. I love that. I love that. Like they went over it twice or something, right? They meaning, yeah, like you hear something, and I'm trying to think, like, I feel like it's giving me like this thing, like it just happened to me lately, and I'm not thinking about, like, I'm trying to think of like when this was, but when you read something and you're like, this doesn't make sense to me, but I have respect for the person who said it, so I'm going to read it again because I there must be something that I'm missing here.
Right.
And maybe there isn't. But
what if it's like reconsider? Shonin, like to go over a second time, to reconsider. Okay, like you said, wait a minute. I think I disagree, but let me reconsider. Maybe that's what's going on here.
And it means something. It that has the valence of, like, they respected each other that much. Or, I mean, I guess I should say that the House of Hillel. Like, I don't like to make like Shammai the villain here, but like, but I do think at the very least it means that one of the qualities of the school of Hillel, and this I'm all in favor, right, is to say, like, have respect for your opponent. They're human beings, and we're part of this community together. We're in relationship together. Like, so if they say something that you disagree with, really, really, really listen. Like, that is the community that we want to live in, right?
And what's coming up for me now is this text in conversation with the Rabbi Eliezer and the Oven of Achnai text, where there's this profound disagreement, and what happens over there? The person in the minority, holding the minority view, gets excommunicated. That's what this text is saying, don't do. Because what it's saying, let's go back to teach. Let's say Shonin is really about teaching. So the House of Hillel was not only not excommunicating Beit Shammai, they are keeping this opinion that they wholly disagree with as part of the tradition. They're recording it. They're passing it down. And one thing we know, or one thing I've learned about why they pass down opinions with which they disagree is because maybe at some point in the future, someone is going to look at that minority opinion or dismissed opinion and say, wait a minute, y'all missed something there. That's the one that we need to lift up right now.
Yeah, I'm holding two ideas in my head. They're not two different ideas, but there's two ideas that sort of come to mind as you're talking. One is that that it's interesting that so if the idea here is that contradictory things are both the words of God, the living words of God, the words of the living God, then this question of, like, do we listen to a bat kol or not is one of those questions. Do we excommunicate the dissenter or actually have great respect for the dissenter and marry our daughters to them, and and repeat their, restate their review and restate their opinions or not? That they're also both. So that's kind of a fascinating, like, place to hold at the end of this. And then that other piece about dissents, it makes me think also about the in American constitutional law, where there are these great dissents that originally were dissents, they were minority views, and eventually they in a later, much later, the Supreme Court has, adopts them as the law and basically says we got it wrong, 100 years ago, and we're changing. But that dissent that was written, Brandeis wrote some important dissents, and today Ruth Bader Ginsburg is, known as the great dissenter. And really the question is what will be in 50 years and 100 years. And if it turns out that it's not only that, like, it turns out that they were right, or, that society decided to go in that direction, but it's that they're actually, the dissent that they wrote back then becomes significant. It's pulled forward. It's their words still matter. And so therefore it's still worthy and important to record those words, and not just to say, well, I feel okay because maybe one day my views will be in the majority. I really believe that. I'll go to my grave believing that. But no, actually, it's that maybe your own words will become remembered again and pulled forward, and that's why you should write them. I mean, there's something in there that's very interesting to me.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I think this ties to why it's so important to get, the queerest folk, the folks who haven't been in on the process in, because when they come in, that's when those dissenting opinions, those things which were passed down but not followed and didn't become the law, are something important in them that was not noticed and understood before as an essential truth suddenly, jumps out like a donkey story and, becomes lifted up, and the tradition gets bigger that way.
Maybe as to in closing on this specific episode and topic, although I think we may come back to this. What you just said makes me think about is, like, how can the queer folk today write down, right, meaning so that it's not just a process, but it's also a even if it's in dissent, how can that stuff be memorialized so that it can be available to a future generation? Like, that's an interesting sort of project to imagine.
Yeah, we're working on that.
All right. So next week we will be back at our normal time on Thursdays, and Thursdays at noon Eastern, and we're excited. I think we're at our regular time. It might not be. We'll if you we will have program notes on the Jewish Live Facebook page. But we will be back next week. In fact, we might even be back twice. I don't know. There's some things going on in the next couple of weeks, but we will. You should check the Jewish Live Facebook page to make sure. All right.
So fun.
It's great to see you.
Likewise. Thanks, Dan.
Bye.
Bye.